All right, well, we've come to module number 6, and what we're doing here is making a transition. We've done some sample exegesis. We've looked at several New Testament texts that speak to the issue of salvation, how people get right with God, how they stay right with God. And having looked at those three, we're now going to change approaches. A second approach that I shared with you earlier on is the approach of biblical theology, and that's attempting to understand what the Bible writers were thinking. What was that fund of knowledge and experience that lay behind what they were saying as they wrote the biblical stuff? How was God working in their lives before they ever wrote that down? What was the context? What did these things mean back then? So you could do that in the small form. What was Isaiah's view of salvation? What was Abraham's view of salvation? And we will do some of that. But then there's the larger picture. 66 books of the Bible. What was God's purpose in touching the hearts of all these individuals to write what they did? Is there a larger theme, a larger purpose that can change our lives today? And so we will walk from Genesis to Revelation and see the large picture on this subject biblically. And then in the last module, module 10, we will shift to that more practical, systematic kind of theology and say, all right, now that we have all of this, we've done some exegesis, we've done some biblical theology on this subject, what difference does it make today? And that's where the rest of this class is going. And in some ways, I think this is my favorite part of the class, although I enjoy all of it. But actually putting the hermeneutic to use. Hermeneutics can be boring. Just this is how you do it. But it's when you put it to use and you see the Bible come alive, that's when things get really excited. So, let me start this subject, the essence of Old Testament faith. A lot of people feel that the Old Testament and the New Testament are two different worlds. That in the Old Testament, people get saved by works. They get saved by where they were born. If you're an Israelite, then you're saved. If you're a Gentile, you're pretty much toast, But a few people like Naaman, maybe Queen of Sheba and so on, a few here and there, mixed multitude coming out of Egypt, that worm their way into the people of God. Abraham has some servants who aren't part of his family. They become part of the community as well. So there's the sense that there's an ethnic, there's a geographical, there's a works-based kind of gospel. All right? And then the New Testament sweeps that away and says, now you're saved by faith, apart from works. You see that? It's a very strong view. I think Luther, maybe not to that extreme, but Luther certainly seemed inclined in that direction, that much of the Old Testament was too Jewish. There was a radical back in the 2nd century named Marcion who took it to the ultimate extent in that the God of the Old Testament was almost evil and had to be swept away. And so for Marcion, there was no Old Testament anymore. That's useless. We're past that. Way too Jewish. But, and even most of the New Testament was way too Jewish for him. So he ended up with 10 of Paul's letters and an edited, shortened version of the Gospel of Luke. And that was all the Bible that Marcion had. And he was a Christian. He was a noted Christian. We not only have some of his writings, we have people reacting against him. And so that was one position that, to more or less extent, others have followed through the years. Paul, on the other hand, that Marcion would have looked to as the real deal, Paul himself said, this is the same gospel as was taught to Israel. So Paul seems to believe that he's not a renegade, that he's not overturning the universe, that he's simply interpreting the Old Testament the way the Old Testament interpreted itself. And one thing you want to notice in the website is that there's a couple places there, where, especially preparing for your, the part here on the Old Testament, there's a couple of places where there are links to material that talks about how Old Testament writers model on earlier Old Testament writers. And that kind of hermeneutic is very strong in the New Testament that we'll be learning about. So it seems for the New Testament writers, they don't see the Old Testament as something to be discarded. They see it as it's their Bible. And when they're teaching the gospel, they're using their Bible to teach it. So that means rather than discarding the Old Testament, we need to learn to read the Old Testament the way they would have read it. And when we read it the way they would have read it, the Old Testament can teach the gospel. Now, for those of you from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective, Ellen White seems to believe the same thing. Because in Review and Herald, September 24, 1908, she makes the following statement. The story of a crucified and risen Savior is the great central theme of the Word of God. She doesn't say of the New Testament. The great central theme of the Word of God. The entire Bible is about a crucified and risen Savior. You have any ideas of where you'd find that in the Old Testament? You know, maybe we'd think Isaiah 53, but it's got to be more than that. If it's the central theme, it's got to be more than one chapter. You know, we know that chapter, and beyond that, well, I'm not sure. Maybe Psalm 22. You know, we might have a couple of them there. Could it be the central theme of the whole Old Testament? If so, where are you going to find it? That's the mission that we're going to be on in the next couple of modules here. There's another place where she says that every line of the Old Testament is irradiated with the Son of God. It's like, whoa, I got some learning to do. You see? All right, so let's not go to the Old Testament to find what we want to find, but let's go to the Old Testament and just let's imagine that you've never read the Bible before. It would be hard for any of us here in this room to do that. But imagine if you never read the Bible before and you just picked it up and you start working through it. What kind of book is it? What observations would you make? Imagine you've read it for the first time and just coming at it from a secular background. What kind of book is it? History? Okay. I think that's definitely the impression one would have to have. It seems to be the history of a people. And probably at first glance, that's the first takeaway that one would have. It's a book of history. But what kind of history? What kind of history do you find there?
History of redemption of a people.
Okay. The term redemption would probably be a puzzling one to the average secular person, but following what I think you're trying to say, it would be the history of God and his dealings with a particular people. So it's not a secular history, but it's a history coming from the conviction of a God who interacts with people, who works with a group of people. And as you read, let's ponder on this. How does God interact with his people? Does he just speak in quiet voices and guide them on small, everyday decisions, like we might experience God today? Is that how he works, or does he work in a different way? Just thinking Old Testament now.
He does both. He does quiet, but he does big stuff too.
Okay. He does quiet and he does big stuff too. How often does he do the quiet?
Usually when he's talking with one person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the surprising things is if you look through how little supernatural there is in the Bible. If you're looking for miracles and dramatic interactions, there's not that many points. You know, I think you have like the Exodus time. You have Elijah and Elisha. you have New Testament. So that's 3 generations out of 1,500 years where there's spectacular stuff and where God speaks audibly to people. But that little day-to-day stuff, kind of stuff, is featured less than you would think. We tend to gravitate to some of the spectacular stories, and then we feel guilty that our lives are not that interesting. And yet most Old Testament people, David seems to have had a voice in his head. It's over and over again, God actually speaks to him. He says, go to Keilah, or don't go to Keilah, or the king is out to kill you, you got to leave right now. And so David has this ringing personal engagement with God. Much of the Kings and Chronicles, you see ordinary people just trying to figure stuff out and getting blamed for it, and, doing a bad job most of the time. Kings and Chronicles passes judgment on people's lives, but you don't get the impression that aside from some prophets from time to time, that they heard a lot of voices or some of that guidance. So you have definitely in the Old Testament this idea of God's big actions. That seems to be a central feature of that history. God is not on the sideline. God is not just moving a person here and a person there. He's doing big stuff. And one scholar wrote an Old Testament theology. It's called the Book of the Acts of God. That's the title he gave to the Old Testament. God then is revealed in 2 ways in the Old Testament. We're used to one of these, but he's revealed in 2 ways in the Old Testament. So God is revealed in his actions. And 2, in the interpretations of those actions. So he's revealed in actions, in his deeds, but also in the interpretation of those actions. Now, does the interpretation come before or after God acts? After, definitely. God will do a mighty action, then he'll explain it. Or the Exodus, for example. He does the Exodus, and then for the next 40 years, there are different explanations of what the Exodus means. Do the interpretations ever come before the action?
Sometimes.
We call that prophecy, or prediction. Right? So sometimes what God will do is predicted ahead of time. And the beauty of prophecy is not that it's so totally different from everything else. The beauty of it is that as God acts, you can know that he's acting, even if you have no direct interpretation coming to you. If you can see things fulfilling themselves in history and you're saying, okay, this is God working and here's where he's going. So prophecy, predictive prophecy, enables you to interpret what God will do when the time comes and what his purpose is when the time comes. So if the interpretation comes before the action, then we call it prophecy. If it comes after the action, it's explanation or interpretation. But here's the point. And this is something I don't think, if we were to take a devotional reading of the Bible, if we go with the Alexandria, if we read the Bible from the perspective of our own needs, our focus will be here. Number 2, on the interpretations. People will study the prophecies. They'll study the interpretations. They'll try to draw principles from what God has said for their lives today. We don't tend to focus on his actions. The Gospels can be frustrating in the sense they often don't give a lot of interpretation. They're just describing what Jesus said and did. And in Mark, he doesn't even say all that much. You don't have long sermons in Mark the way you do in some of the other gospel writers. So the focus is on the actions, and the actions themselves are a revelation of God. So going back to the Old Testament, God's Word is more than what He says. God's Word includes His actions. Now this is very, very critical, because for the Hebrew, what God does is as important as what He says, because God is consistent. So what God does, He will do again. Could put it another way, God's actions are a prophecy of His future actions. Because He's consistent, you can know what He will do in the future by what He has done in the past. And this is part of Hebrew thinking. You see, Western Greek thinking is all about the ideas. We want to get the facts. We want to know the truth. We want to get the doctrine down. And there's a lot in the Bible that supports those doctrines, those teachings. But the Hebrew way of thinking isn't into fundamental beliefs in the way that we are. That's more of a Greek Western thing. And they're good. Don't misunderstand me. Greek Western people need to have guidelines like that so that they, don't get off the track. But I rather doubt that Abraham or Moses or some of those would have been too excited about some of that. Rather, Hebrew thought doesn't define God abstractly. A Western creed is kind of like, I believe in God the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Spirit, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. That's a Western creed. Would you like to read a Hebrew creed? Deuteronomy 6. Fundamental beliefs, ancient Hebrew style. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 20 to 25. Deuteronomy 6 and verses 20 to 25. In the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you, tell him. Okay, there's the introduction. We'll stop right there. The son is asking, what do you believe, Dad? What does all this mean? Why should we bother? Okay, this is the core question. And we would respond by saying, well, let's start with number 1. And we'll go through the 28, and I'll explain to you what we believe. Notice how the answer, and this answer is scripted by Moses under the inspiration of God. Here's the creed. We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes, the Lord sent miraculous signs and wonders, great and terrible, upon Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. But He brought us out from there to bring us in and give us the land that He promised on oath to our forefathers. The Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. And if we are careful to obey all this law before the Lord our God, as He has commanded us, that will be our righteousness. So what is this? It's a story. The son asks a theological question. What does all this mean? Right? Theological question. Answer, historical review. Oh, well, here's what God has done. And it's all about God. God is the one that the theology is all about. Isn't that what the Greek word means, theology? The study of God. And yet we often end up studying human ideas about God instead of God Himself and how He revealed Himself. This isn't so much reasoning as it is a recital of what God has done. And we know God by what he has done. So his actions become the theology. And it includes a whole-souled response, to obey whatever God says. So God gives a lot of instructions. We obey them because we're in relationship with God. Remember we talked earlier about, do works lead to faith or do they flow from faith? What would the Old Testament answer be? Where do the works flow from? From the faith. From what God has done. God acts first. We put ourselves into that orbit, and then we obey. So the order, the gospel order, is right here. But it's not intellectual. It's saying, what does this mean? Well, God did this, God did this, God did this. And you recite the history of what God has done. So, and by the way, I could read you dozens of texts just like that. I gave you a sample because it was relatively short. Some of them, like Psalm 78, can be 70 verses long. And it's the same kind of thing. It's a recital of the mighty acts of God. And when we read those kind of psalms, it's kind of like they're just going on and on and on. Well, that's the point. That's what it's all about. It's what God has done. Now, let me ask you to think about something. And in your outline, you can go to letter B. Letter A is history. That's what we've been talking about. The Bible is a history book, or salvation history. It's a history of God's actions. But letter B is worship. And I want to start by asking the question, what is worship? What do you understand worship to be? What is a Protestant view of worship? What is an Adventist view of worship? I mean, what's it all about?
I've heard some say it's a response, it's this human response to a God who has done some mighty acts or who has done something for
I think you're way too influenced by what we've already covered this morning. I think you're absolutely right. That's a biblical perspective. But is that what most people think worship is? Most people think worship is instruction.
Yes.
Okay, now we're going to tell you how to live. We preach about this is what you ought to do, and this is how you ought to think, and so on. Worship is something we do and come together and celebrate together and fellowship together and all those kind of terms. The Hebrew concept of worship, though, is more like what you were saying. In the Hebrew concept of worship, it's all about God, first of all, and second of all, it's about what He has done. Now, when you really bore down into that, do we worship very often? Let's take a look at some texts. I don't want you to take my word for it. And these are only samples. But I would challenge you, the next time you read the Old Testament through, to look for all the worship texts and see what's going on there. So what I'm trying to do is from long experience with these texts, giving you clues. Here's the map. When you go through, you're going to look for this, this, and this, because that's what you will find. Psalm 111:4. He has caused His wonders to be remembered. The Lord is gracious and compassionate. Psalm 111:4. He's caused His wonders, His mighty acts, His miracles. He's caused them to be remembered. So God acts with the intent that those who receive the action will remember it. And in Hebrew thinking, remembering is not an intellectual thing. That's one of the confusions. We say, well, God remembered something. And we're saying, When did God forget? No. That's not the Hebrew concept. With Hebrew, remembering happens when you act on a fact. That rhymes. You act on something that you know. That's remembering. For the Hebrew, if you don't act on it, you didn't remember. It may be in your head. If it doesn't change your actions, you didn't remember. So, for the Hebrew, remembering must include action. So remembering is kind of a lot like faith. In Paul, you remember what God has done, you act accordingly. Let's look at an example of this. Psalm 78. And this is one of the great creedal psalms of the Old Testament, these grand statements of faith. Psalm 78, we could read the whole thing, but that would take the rest of the half hour. Let's just read the first 15 verses. Psalm 78, starting with verse 1. O my people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter hidden things, things from of old, what we have heard and known, what our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, His power, and the wonders He has done. So, what is the story that's going to be told? It's not about us. It's not about Israel. It's not about David and all the grand things that have happened here. It's about God. The wonderful things He has done, the mighty acts. Verse 5, He decreed statutes for Jacob, established the law in Israel, which He commanded our forefathers to teach their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born. They in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget His deeds. Let me just stop there for a moment. This is fundamental theology, Old Testament theology of salvation. God does mighty acts. He intends that they be remembered, and not only remembered by those who experience them, but passed on from generation to generation to continually be remembered, so that those actions would be the focus of their actions. If they would continually remember whole person. Loma Linda's about whole person, wholeness, Hebrew. All right? A whole person remembers with action. You act upon it. So that the next generation would know them, even children yet to be born. They in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in the Lord. Where does trust come from? From a knowledge of God and what He has done. As you review what God has done in the past, it builds trust in the present. So faith gets built when you recite what God has done. Maybe that's why we struggle with faith sometimes in the Western world. Because instead of talking about what God has done, our worship services are about what we ought to do. Yeah, true. We need revival. Mm-hmm. Well, that's true. But are we going to get it by talking about it? We need revival. Revival comes when we learn about God, when we discover what God has done in our lives. Follow up, verse 7. Then they would put their trust in God, would not forget His deeds, but would keep His commands. They would not be like their forefathers. Okay, what were the forefathers like? A stubborn and rebellious generation whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to Him. This remembering, this talking about what God has done, that is the essence of worship, and when it occurs, it results in faith, in trust. And that's the key. We saw that in Paul. That faith and trust is what really, really matters. It's not the works themselves, but it's that confidence in God, that trust in God. And when we trust God, our actions will follow. We don't have to manufacture them. The men of Ephraim, verse 9, though armed with bows, turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep God's covenant and refused to live by His law. They forgot what He had done. The problem with Ephraim, they forgot what He had done, the wonders He had showed them. And let me stop right there. So you see, this remembering, forgetting concept is so important in the Old Testament context. If you remember what God has done, if you take time meditating on what God has done, you will trust Him, you will have faith in Him, and your actions will show it. If you forget what God has done, if you get distracted, if you focus on this world, you'll forget what God has done, and you won't be responding to Him. So, with that dynamic in mind, you can see the whole issue of the secular world. The whole issue of the secular world is that you're just distracted. You forget. It's not that secular people are perverse, that they hate God. They're too busy to remember, too busy to put Him central. It's one reason why I love being at Loma Linda, because religion doesn't come easy or cheap here. Faith doesn't come easy or cheap. You are boggled night and day chasing after all kinds of details and a very complicated business, healthcare, and healthcare education. Very complicated business. And you could simply forget all the spiritual stuff, focus on the task, and have plenty to do. And when you realize that God has got to be central to the whole thing, you've got to deliberately arrange your life to put God in the middle of it. I like that, because it not only requires us to go out of our way to be God-centered. It doesn't just come, everybody's talking about it, so, we just kind of drift along. But it's a battle and a march to keep that remembrance in line. And when you do, then it can become a model for secular people who are struggling with the same issues. If you're in an ivory tower somewhere, like monks, and you're having this wonderful faith experience with God, it comes easy. But when you're out there in the rough and tumble of the real world, that's a whole other story. And so I have found that, the faith that I have found here has been a more practical faith, a faith, I'm not trying to denigrate anybody else, please don't misunderstand. I'm just saying that in the rough and tumble of a secular context, texts like these become life and death. Unless we run this before our eyes every day and say, Lord, I need to take time to focus on what you have done, because unless we do that, we forget. And when we forget, we act differently. What did they forget? Verse 12. Going back to verse 11, they forgot what He had done, the wonders He had shown them. He did miracles in the sight of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the region of Zoan. He divided the seas and led them through. He made the water stand firm like a wall. He guided them with a cloud by day and with a light from the fire by night. He split the rocks in the desert. He gave them water as abundant in the seas. And it goes on for 72 verses. The Hebrews got so excited about what God had done that they couldn't stop. We'd be bored long before we get to the end of Psalm 78, but they're excited. He did this, and He did this, and He did this. And the more you talk about what God has done, it's more like, wow, you see? And they were piling on one thing on top of the other. God is so great. God is so awesome. And they were so excited by this. When they would recount what God had done, they would remember. And when they remembered, they obeyed. They did what God wanted them to do, because it was the natural thing to do when they were remembering. When they forget, they would slip. The relationship would be lost and they'd be on their own. So remembrance, remembering what God has done, brings you back. And that's the essence of worship. Worship is all about recounting what God has done. Now, if that's all we had to say about it, it would be a life of tedium, it would seem. Oh, I'm going to spend the rest of my life just reciting what God has done over and over and over again. Boring. Well, it's not boring. And the reason it's not boring is an additional element that we'll find in Psalm 66. Psalm 66 and verses 3 through 6. Psalm 66 and verses 3 through 6. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds! So great is your power that your enemies cringe before you. All the earth bows down to you. They sing praise to you, sing praise to your name. Come and see what God has done, how awesome his works in man's behalf. He turns the sea into dry land. They pass through the waters on foot. Come and let us rejoice in him. Now, what are these mighty acts that we're talking about here? In every case, they were an action where God brought his divine power to bear to rescue his people. The Exodus, water stood up like a wall. Bottom of the sea was dry. They marched through. Their enemies couldn't follow. When their enemies did follow, they were destroyed. God did what human beings could not do. Mighty, mighty actions. Here's the secret. When you recite what God has done, it brings the power of the original action back. It resurrects in your life the kind of action that God did for the Israelites back then. When you recite what God has done in the past, the power of the past action becomes real in the present. And that is the critical thing. Because we need that. We need it desperately. In a secular context, we sense that lack of power. We sense that lack of presence. But the presence and power of God comes real when we recite what God has done, when we review what God has done. And for the Israelites, the great theme that they recited over and over again was the Exodus story. You saw that in Psalm 78, and we saw it in Deuteronomy 6, and we saw it in Psalm 66, turning the sea into dry land. That was the Exodus. They passed through on foot, Exodus all over again. So for them, the consummate act of God was the Exodus. And whenever they recited the Exodus, the power of the Exodus would return. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Daniel 9. Daniel's kind of discouraged. It's the 70th year, apparently, or close to it, maybe the 68th or 69th. He starts Daniel 9, he says, Jeremiah prophesied we'd be in Babylon 70 years. That would be important to Daniel, because he came as a teenager. Now he's about 85, and he's saying, should be time to go home. But nothing's happening. In fact, they've just gone through this upheaval, and nothing's happening. And so he prays to God. And what happens? How does he pray? If it was me, I'd be kind of like, oh, Lord, what's going on? What's wrong? Do something. Help us. You're supposed to be doing something. That's not how he prays. He recites the whole history of what God has done. And before he's finished praying, Gabriel shows up and says, when you started praying, I got sent. So clearly, Daniel's reciting what God had done brought Gabriel from heaven. God redid the power of the Exodus for Daniel. And of course, what we know is that he explains to Daniel, actually, when the 70 comes to an end, there'll be a new 70 times 7. So God's going to start all over. You're about to see a brand new age coming in. And of course, In chapter 10 of Daniel, we see Daniel continuing that prayer for 3 weeks because Cyrus was struggling in his mind whether he should deliver God's people or not. Apparently that's the context. And extra power comes into that situation, and Cyrus changes his mind and lets the people go. So Daniel's prayers changed the world. But they weren't prayers of pleading. It wasn't a vending machine prayer. It was a recital of what God had done that brought the power of the Exodus into Babylon. Another example, 2 Chronicles 2, you know the story. Judah is being invaded by 3 countries. They're outnumbered 3-1. And they remembered that when Solomon dedicated the temple, he said, "If ever we are in trouble here, Lord, we will gather in this place, look to you, and we expect your power to be engaged." So Jehoshaphat calls for a worship service for everybody to come and let's entreat the Lord for this great political military crisis that we are facing. And if I had been Jehoshaphat, I probably would have been pretty abject on that occasion too. You know, "Oh Lord, help us, we're surrounded, we're in trouble, we're going to die, do something." No, Jehoshaphat tells the Exodus story. He recounts the history of the Exodus. 2 Chronicles 20. And no sooner is his prayer done when somebody pops up in the audience and says, "Believe his prophets and all will be good." In other words, he's giving them encouragement that this is going to be all right. So Jehoshaphat, recognizing that the power of the Exodus was about to return, decides instead of sending the army, he's going to send the choir.
Yes.
What was he doing there? He was acting on the trust. You see? He trusted that what God did before, he will do again. And in that trust, he changed plans, changed strategies, dumped his strategy, and followed God's direction. And when they got to the battlefield, the enemies were pretty much gone. So that's examples that when you recount the mighty acts of God, the power of the original event is rekindled in the present.
How do we do that today?
Same way. Well, the rest of the class is all about answering that question. So I won't give you the simple answer now. I won't give you the spoiler, okay? But the rest of the class is all about how does that work? How does this concept get retaken in the New Testament? And then how do we take that New Testament concept and make it happen today? The very 10th module is all about how does that happen today? And that's critical. So, what does it mean to you to have a history? What difference does history make in your life? And I'm not thinking now history books, but your own personal history. What matters here? It seems to me that history tells us where we belong. And we can choose to focus on our human history, or we can choose to focus on God's history, on the history that we have in God, who we are in God. The history tells you who you are. And when you're talking about chaplaincy, for example, you have people that have a choice of 2 histories. They can live in the history of their own experience, which is where you have pain, where you have abuse, where you have rejection, suffering, abandonment, etc. And when people are focused on that history, they're in a tailspin they can never get out of. But when we turn our focus to what God has done, we discover that there's a new history there. There's an alternate history. It's the history of what God has done. And ultimately what God has done in the past becomes our story. That's the dynamic that's going on here. History provides a sense of who we are, of where we belong. So what history you choose is critical. It's a frame of reference in which you look at everything else. And it becomes the basis for worship. Do you worship the human heroes of your past? Do you worship the mighty things that you have done and brag about them and repeat them everywhere you go? I killed Osama bin Laden. Therefore, I'm awesome, and you should vote for me. I hope I'm being equal opportunity here. Okay, I ragged on the other guy last time. Okay, please. I'm only using illustrations. These are human beings, and both of them have demonstrated that abundantly, that they're human beings, and we do the best we can, make our choice. But the point, you just see that if your focus is on your history and the mighty things that you have done, that's as far as you're going to get. That's all you got. All right. We worship the guide for the history we have chosen. And to worship God is to choose His history as ours, His mighty actions as ours. All right, let's continue with this particular domain. We're in the essence of Old Testament faith. And in the first couple parts of that, we saw that history is very central to what is going on in the Old Testament, and that history becomes very central to the whole concept of worship. That worship is all about what God has done, and the beauty of worship is that as we recite what God has done, His presence becomes real to us. His power, the power of those original actions comes to us. And this is, of course, the greatest imaginable delight as it happens. But as you read the Bible, it's not just a history book, is it? Is there another domain that's just saturated all the way through there? Thinking back into the books of Moses and so on, what other dynamic is there besides the history? I would say the second strongest dynamic, if you're just reading it through, is law. It's a law book. So much so that the Torah is sometimes called the law. There's a lot of legal stuff. Language like covenant, statute, laws, commands, stipulations, etc. So there's a ton of legal language in the Bible. So you have history of a people's relationship to God. And now you have all this legal stuff. So what's that all about? In the Hebrew way of thinking, law is not an abstract. Law is not just some stuff off in a book somewhere that affects our lives only when we stumble into it. You drive a few miles too fast and then suddenly you're concerned about law. But generally law is just this cold outside thing. But that's not the way Hebrews look at it. Because as Hebrews understand it, the purpose of law is relational. You have rules, you have laws to regulate relationships. It's all about relationships. Using marriage as an example. Why would one need a legal ceremony to be in a relationship with someone? Because the laws, the commitments, the covenants made there protect the relationship. They set the boundaries of the relationship. They help people to know what they're getting in that relationship. And that it is not simply a casual thing, but it's going to be lifelong. It's as long as that relationship is useful to both parties, these regulations will govern it. So in the Hebrew context, law is about relationship. And therefore it's not just cold. It's not just legal. It's actually a vibrant relational organism. More than that, God's actions in history are seen in legal terms. When God acts in history, it's not just a president who is making decisions and directing soldiers or diplomats or bureaucrats or whatever to carry out those decisions. There is a foundation, there's a constitution, there's a legal framework that governs all of that. Let's look at an example of that, Psalm 105. Psalm 105, verses 5 through 10. It's going to sound familiar. Psalm 105 and verse 5. Remember the wonders he has done. Remember the wonders. That sounds like other texts we've read, and they're all over the place. Remember the wonders he has done, his miracles and the judgments he pronounced. That's a legal word. O descendants of Abraham his servant, O sons of Jacob his chosen ones, he is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant, another legal word, forever. The word he commanded for 1,000 generations, the covenant he made with Abraham, the oath he swore to Isaac. He confirmed it to Jacob as a decree, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. What's that, 6 different legal words all crammed in there? We have judgments, we have covenant, we have oath, we have confirmation, covenant again, legal decree, legal language, piled on legal language, to talk about what God had done. So what God has done in history is related to the covenant, to law. So to think in terms of these historical things only in and of itself is not enough. There's a strong legal foundation in all of God's actions. So when God is acting, he is not just arbitrary. He is acting according to certain principles and standards that he has laid out. Deuteronomy 30 talks further about this legal side. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 15. Because covenants are two-sided. There are usually two parties. And there are stipulations that are binding on both parties. And here we see Deuteronomy 30 verse 15. It gives people alternatives. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today, Deuteronomy 30, 15 to 19, I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. Notice something. It's not only to walk in his commands, but to do what else? Walk in his ways. God is not commanding anything other than what he himself is willing to do. He himself subjects himself to his own covenant. So this is an amazing thing, that the great God of the universe, in a sense, incarnates himself into the covenant with Israel. He says, okay, here's how I'm going to live. So you live the way I live, and everything will go well. So the legal language is going to regulate the relationship between God and Israel. This is really important. Notice verses 17 and on. But if your heart turns away and you're not obedient, And if you're drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life that you and your children may live. So he's offering alternatives here. They can enter into this covenant with him and receive the blessings that are in it, or they can choose not to be in the covenant and lose all those blessings. So covenants in ancient times regulated relationships, and they had blessings and curses. What the blessings and curses in practical terms simply are, they're the consequences of obeying the covenant or not. Let me give you an example. We used to live in Berrien Springs, Michigan. And Berrien Springs, Michigan is a river town. There's a river that kind of wraps itself all around the town. And there's one bridge to cross that river, right downtown. And one day, some government contractor came and looked at the bridge and noticed that you could see the water from above as you're driving across the bridge. Through the road. Not good. There were cracks, holes, etc. In other words, the bridge was crumbling. How long it had been going on? Nobody knew. It was about 50, 60 years old. And basically he said, bridge closed immediately. The next car might go through. Just don't know. So they closed the bridge immediately. The only way to cross the river outside of that was like 10 miles on either side. They were working on a superhighway on the other side of town that would also have a bridge. And so they accelerated that, but then was the issue, what do we do downtown? Essentially, the day the bridge closed, the downtown died. Because before it had been a stop along the way, and people going somewhere else might stop to eat and stop to get something that they needed and so on. Now it became a dead end. Nobody was going to drive 15 miles for that downtown because there was much better stuff up by the other bridges somewhere else, you see. Walmart was up there, and Target was up there and all those kind of places. So that little downtown basically was disintegrating by the minute. So in desperation, they said, we've got to build as fast as possible. And they says, all right, well, if we replace the bridge where it is, it's going to take us a lot longer. We've got to dismantle the old one and start all over. The old one's not worth preserving. It had a wooden foundation that was crumbling too. So they decided to build a new bridge next to the bridge. And when they're done with the bridge and cars are going on, then the old one can be dismantled and at leisure. And the townspeople put into the covenant blessings and curses. They said the fastest we could possibly build this bridge is 9 months from today. 9 months of community death. So I said, all right, that's the best you can do. They wrote into the contract, for every day over the 9 months, they would reduce $10,000 from what they pay for the bridge. And for every day the bridge gets done early, they'll give an additional $10,000 to the builders. Those are blessings and curses. What do you think happened? The bridge was done 26 days early. You see? But blessings and curses simply lay out ahead of time, here's what's going to happen. If you're part of this thing, here's the good things that are going to happen. If you decide not to be part of it, here's the consequences. So blessings and curses is just a biblical Hebrew way of describing what we would recognize, I think, that when we do covenants and contracts, that they too have blessings and curses. They're just not usually, nobody writes curses into your home mortgage these days. They use different language than that. So for the Hebrew, law is not cold, formal, and harsh. Do you think the residents of Berrien Springs were happy with those curses? They were very happy. You see, because the stipulations of that law gave them the security that if my business can hold out for 9 months, a better day is coming. Then we'll be able to survive. All we have to do is find a way to survive for 9 months, and things are going to be okay again. So that the legal framework there, while it may seem arbitrary and cold and harsh, it actually was warm to the hearts of the residents of that town, because it meant that their time of trouble had an end, and things were going to get better. And so they rejoiced over that covenant, and they counted the days until that covenant would be complete and the bridge would be built. It provided security. You know, if the government had come in and says, yeah, we'll build a bridge when we have the money, when we have the time, when we think about it, terrible insecurity. No knowing whether it would ever be built. So the legal framework gave the town the security to survive. And a legal framework gives us security. Keep in mind that the typical gods of the ancient world were extremely petulant, changeable, arbitrary. They wake up on the wrong side of the bread feeling out of sorts, and they'd kill off 10,000 tribesmen, you know. And you just never know when the lightning was going to strike. That's what it was like to be religious in the ancient world. That's what it was like to be an Assyrian and an Egyptian, very insecure. And here you have a God who says, okay, I will not only give you laws. All the gods are willing to give laws. This God was willing to abide by them. I'm going to tell you what I will do. If you do this, I'll do that. You do that, I'll do that. You have choices here. You're free. And I just want you to know how I'm going to behave. You can predict what I'm going to do based on what you choose to do. That's security. That's a comfort zone. You know the rules. And as painful as this may be, children who are raised in an environment where the rules are clear and strictly enforced are more secure. Am I right on that? I mean, some of you know more about this stuff than I do, but it just seems like children are more secure when they know what the rules are and when those rules are strictly and consistently enforced. And they know the boundaries. No matter how strict it may be, they can be happy. Look at the Amish children. I mean, most of these, we wouldn't want children to have to live like that. But they know their boundaries. They're secure, and they're happy. You know, their life is very plain where they fit and so on. Whereas parents who set no boundaries for the kids, the rules are arbitrary one day and the next day it's not, and so on. Those kids are very confused. I don't really know if my parents care. They don't care. They don't love me. They don't care. You know. So I just want you to get the sense that this whole legal concept in the Hebrew thinking is not a negative. In Western thinking, it becomes a negative. And I meet so many Christians that just say the legal parts of the Bible, I just sort of ignore them. You know.
I would like to tack on to that.
Sure.
Yes, it would be more secure to have rules, but also with reasonings behind those rules. Mm-hmm. When the rules are arbitrary, where you have to go to bed at 9 o'clock, why? Because I said so, then that doesn't leave comfort. But when you know that the intention comes from love and the reasons for it are explained, mm-hmm. because that's what I think a lot of my friends are not in the church or have just gone off and done different things, is because the reasons weren't explained to them. And a lot of those people had very conservative upbringings where there were a lot of rules, but then the rules weren't necessarily explained to them why they were the way that they were, and that changes things. So with God forming this rule, he's letting us know, hey, I love you, but then he also explains why these things are the way that they are.
Mm-hmm. And I think it also helps if the parents themselves abide by those rules. If they make rules for the kids and then they don't follow them, that's, that's a stretch for the kids as well. If the parents delight in the rules, they say, this is the best kind of life. And that's what I see with the Amish. The parents delight in that life. And they want their kids to have the same delight, And then it becomes a workable thing. Even though you take a teenager from New York and you put him in an Amish community, they say, this is hell. It's the worst life I could ever imagine, you see. But that's because they haven't lived in that kind of structure before. So for the Hebrew, law is not cold, formal, and harsh. It is something that provides security, sets boundaries, etc. And in the Old Testament, right makes might. The power lies in being right, doing the right thing, rather than simply, well, I've got the power, so I can do what I want. And I remember my first visit to Russia back, just after the close of the communist era. And things had been so regulated, so tight that people just sort of threw off all their boundaries in a way. And I noticed that there was just an air of chaos. There were no lawns, except in the Kremlin itself, but there were just grass was just growing 4 feet high, and there were paths through it, and everything was just sort of disorganized, unkept, and so on. It was just a sense of unease when the concept of law and regulation and so on was gone. People became very insecure as a result. I grew up in New York City, and for many, many years, New York City was chaos. And then a mayor came along who had a different vision. He had been a prosecutor going after the mafia and stuff. Everybody said, he's going to be tough on crime. But he surprised everyone. He didn't crack down on the bigwigs. He cracked down on the little ones, the squeegee men. The ones that have this little squeegee and they come up and spray your window and they're going like this and they're demanding $1. That's intimidating. That's a sense out of control, chaos. He went after the little stuff, jaywalking, things like that. And people said, this is crazy. Crime dropped 80% during his term. People thought it couldn't be done. And you may remember in 1999, during that time, we arrived in New York and we decided just to go for a walk in downtown, center of Manhattan. 12 o'clock at night, we decided just to go out for a walk with the kids. And I remember my wife saying to me, it feels so safe here. And well, yeah, but why? And suddenly we realized there were dozens and dozens of women walking alone at midnight. That's a safe place. The whole atmosphere felt safe. And when the atmosphere feels safe, where do the criminals go? Somewhere else. It was that simple. Order, a sense of this, something that is right, it can change a whole dynamic. And it changed the whole dynamic of a city, even though to this day the philosophy is still controversial. But it has worked mightily wherever it has been implemented. I think New York City ended up being 133 out of the top 150 cities in crime. Usually the bigger the city, the harder it is to control. And I think, was it last year, New York City had 35 murders between strangers, and Chicago had 1,200 or something. It was it's just a shock, the difference. Again, not trying to be political or anything, but just saying that the biblical genius here, there's something there that people do need a certain boundary, a certain structure. Right makes might. And when God is acting, He's not acting because He's powerful. He's acting because it's right. And when you establish what is right and you act consistently on that basis, good things can happen. I think of Darius in Daniel 6. Do you remember Darius pacing around at night because he can't sleep? Why can't he sleep? Because his friend is in the lion's den. Why is his friend in the lion's den? He's the king, for crying out loud. He can do whatever he wants. He's an absolute dictator. But even he had a structure, a legal structure. He couldn't obey the law and save his friend. And he tried. He went 9 yards, brought lawyers from all directions to find some way within the law that he could save Daniel, and he couldn't find it. Finally says, I'm sorry, I've got to do this. I've got to do this. He couldn't deliver Daniel and uphold the law at the same time. And there was the recognition that if the rule of law breaks down, everything else falls apart with it. Now maybe this is partially an answer to some questions that came up in discussion earlier on. You know, well, God just sets this law and now he's got to kill Jesus, you know, or something like that. And one can say it in that way, and it sounds like a horrible thing. But if you see God pacing like Darius, and you see God saying, if I save these people arbitrarily, it'll break the rule of law in the universe. It'll break that security, and the outcome will be far more tragic than anything that's happened yet. That unless the governing security of the universe can be grounded and established in the way I save them, I will destroy them even in saving them. This is way over my head, okay? But I think when you see law in the Old Testament sense of law, how relational it is, you begin to understand that Christ had to die. That language is a language of absolute must. It's not the language of, well, you know, he chose to die. No, he says, I must suffer. I must die. I must be raised the third day. That's 9 times at least. Just in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's that language of absolute obligation for his death. In some sense, if Christ's death doesn't happen, the integrity of the whole universe is at stake. And we probably will only begin to understand some of that 1,000,000 years into eternity. But I think we catch a glimpse of it. God is using the legal metaphors of the Hebrew people to say something about the essence of his rule in the universe. And we only, like 2-year-olds, we catch a glimpse. And, you know, the answers to our questions fail. But there's one thing I've discovered. You find an atheist, and you're not going to do anything answering their questions. That goes nowhere. Because the very nature of an atheist is that you answer 100 questions, and he'll have 100 more the next day. Because the questions themselves are the escape. So if you play that game, you're going to get nowhere. Answering questions. There are questions we can't answer. And I remember one conversation, you've asked a bunch of questions I can't answer. And it doesn't bother me that I can't answer them. But it really bothers you. So what's the difference between us? I took a risk that one day. I just said, you know, in my experience as a pastor, when someone asks the kind of questions you're asking, it usually means that at some time in their past there's been some sort of moral failure that they have never really dealt with. And I don't know quite how that hit him. He looked a little bit like a deer in the headlights, but his wife was sitting behind him, and she was going like this. So I don't know what was going on there. But that when we transgress the laws of our own being and don't deal with it, we spend the rest of our lives running from that recognition. And these questions throw the blame onto God, throw the blame onto Christians, etc., so that we don't have to deal with the core of it. That was an aside. That had nothing to do with the class, I guess. But the point I'm making here is the role of law in the Old Testament is not abstract. It's deeply embedded in relationships and in the very integrity of the entire world and the entire universe. So, to summarize, and in the outline that you'll find in the website, this would be letter D, which would be a summary of Old Testament faith. Letter C was the role of law and covenant in the Old Testament. And letter D would be a summary of Old Testament faith. So we've got this history and we've got this law. And to summarize all of that, the heart of the Old Testament can be summarized in one word, and that word is Torah. And Torah is often translated as law. And there's a lot to that because there's a lot of law in the Torah. Leviticus is just about all law, just for example. Numbers and Exodus are at least half each. And then there's more scattered through elsewhere as well. But Torah is also history. There's lots of history in there, lots of stories. So ultimately, Torah is, perhaps in the largest sense, means revelation. It's a revelation of God, both what God does and who He is, both what He says and what He does, both His actions and the interpretation of those actions, both the history and the law. Let's take a look at Deuteronomy 26. Deuteronomy 26 and verses 3 through 9. It's another one of those creeds. Deuteronomy 26, 3 to 9. Say to the priest in office, let's go back to verse 1. I want you to get the context. When you have entered the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance and have taken possession of it and settled in it, take some of the first fruits of all you produce from the soil of the land the Lord your God is giving you and put them in a basket. Then go to the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for His name and say to the priest in office at that time. Quote. All right. So when you get your farm, when you get your piece of land, and your first crop is coming up, take the very first fruits of that and go down to the temple or the tabernacle or wherever God happens to have chosen to dwell. Take that down and say the following. So that's the context. It is a thank offering for what God has done. Notice what it says. Say, I declare today to the Lord your God that I have come to the land the Lord swore our forefathers to give us. The priest shall take the basket from your hands, set it down in front of the altar of the Lord your God. Then you shall declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, putting us to hard labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So what's he doing here? Reciting the mighty acts of God again, okay? So we've seen that several times. Here's another one. But follow it just a little bit further. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, with great terror, with miraculous signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, O Lord, have given me. Place the basket before the Lord your God and bow down before Him. And you and the Levites and aliens among you shall rejoice in all the good things your Lord has given you and your household. Now this is a command. He commands them to recite this history. And in the midst of the history, what God has done and the covenant that He has made and all of this is all bound together. What we see is that the history was grounded in the law. God brought them out of Egypt because of a promise He made to Abraham. It's not because they were great people or anything like that. He says, I kept the oath that I swore to Abraham. So I brought you out. So the history, first of all, grounds the covenant. What God has done means we ought to be in covenant with him. But then the covenant also leads to the history. Because of the covenant, God does what he does in history. So the two are intermingled throughout. And what we see in the historical books is that God is judging the history based on his covenant. All right, Israel, did you carry out the relationship that we had with each other? This king did, he was a good king. This king didn't, he was an evil king. Jeroboam was a pretty good king. He definitely was a Yahweh worshiper. He was not into idolatry at all. The one thing he did wrong is he didn't worship in the place that God said, in Jerusalem. And he had political reasons for doing that. Jehu was a mighty warrior for God, destroyed Baal, wiped out the idols, changed the whole religious structure, but he was an evil king because he didn't go to Jerusalem, you see. So the question was, are we willing to engage in relationship with God, which includes reciting his mighty acts and so forth. The rest of the Old Testament is all about history and law and how they relate to each other. The one seeming exception might be the wisdom literature. You don't find a lot of history in Psalms and Proverbs. You don't find a lot of law in Psalms and Proverbs. So some people would say, the rest of it, the prophets are evaluating whether the people, are responding to God's actions in history. The history books are all about, how people are relating to the history and to the law. But what about the wisdom literature? Psalm 1. Psalm 1. I want to show you that this dynamic is found even in the wisdom literature, so that this dynamic between the two, between the history and the law, is kind of at the core of what the Old Testament's all about. The two greatest Old Testament theologies, one of them argues that the center of Old Testament theology is salvation history. The other argues that it's covenant. And I would say you're both right. Because when you read through the Bible, the two are so intermingled you can't separate them. Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. In his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season. His leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. Not so the wicked. They're like chaff that the wind blows away. So the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. The Lord watches over the way of the righteous. The way of the wicked will perish. Most Psalms will not say that, but it shows that lurking behind the Psalms is this legal concept as well. But what has happened here, the shift, is that the wisdom literature individualizes the covenant. You see, what we saw in Deuteronomy is the people are in covenant with God. So it's a national covenant. Deuteronomy is about God's relationship to his people, plural. In Psalms and Proverbs, the covenant is individualized. Now the man who walks in the ways of the Lord is a godly man. And the man who doesn't walk in the ways of God is an ungodly man. In Deuteronomy, it's about the nation. If you obey, plural, you people will prosper. If you disobey, plural, you will come to naught. Same thing as in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 2. And this is the only place in Proverbs where law is mentioned at all. But have a look. Proverbs 2, verses 16 and 17, gives the underlying philosophy of the Proverbs. It says, Proverbs 2, 16 and 17, it says, "It will save you from the adulteress, from the wayward wife with her seductive words, who has left the partner of her youth and ignored" what? "The covenant she made before God." Proverbs doesn't use that language generally, but here you get a glimpse. Wickedness ultimately is ignoring the covenant. It's not walking in the ways of the covenant. Righteousness is doing what the covenant says. So wisdom literature is individualizing the covenant. It's taking the relationship God had with his people, Israel, and it's bringing it home to individuals. Now there's a problem with that, isn't there? Because if you say, if you obey God, you will prosper. And if you disobey God, you're going to be poor and wretched and miserable and so on. Can you say that? Not really. Because where's the balance in the wisdom literature? Psalms and Proverbs are this cheery thing. Obey and everything's good. Disobey and everything will go bad. But what does Job say? I obeyed and look where it got me. And Ecclesiastes, with all of its melancholy. So there's a balance in there. At the heart, the wisdom literature is individualizing the covenant. So it's within that framework. And it's saying that if you obey, good things will happen. If you disobey, bad things will happen. What Ecclesiastes and Job are saying, that's true in a general sense. But in reality, it doesn't always work that way. All other things being equal, the righteous prosper and the wicked come to naught. But things are not always equal. That's the story of Job. Things are not always equal. There are things that happen to good people. There are things that happen to bad people. And they get rich and prosperous and respected. A world that appreciates Snooki and Lady Gaga and Madonna can prosper foolishness, So I'd have to say that the individualization of the covenant needs to be qualified with all other things being equal. The covenant does work, but there are other dynamics sometimes that undermine the outcomes in this life. In the ultimate life, yes, that will take place. But within this life, you don't always see the outcome of that individualization that occurred there. All right, so the appropriate use of the Old Testament, then, is to always see every part of it grounded in the concepts of history and the concepts of covenant. We notice many of the Psalms do refer to the history, but the legal side is less obvious there. So, what does Old Testament history tell us about getting right with God? What does law in the Old Testament tell us about getting right with God? Module 7 is all about answering the question, what do we learn about salvation from Old Testament history? Module 8 is, what do we learn about salvation from Old Testament law? Within. We're going to just look at it within the Old Testament. Is the gospel really there in the Old Testament? That's module 7 and 8. And then module 9 is, how does the New Testament build on that background as a witness to Jesus Christ? And I think in 7 and 8 we also do some of that as well. We reflect at the end what the New Testament has to say about it. And then finally, Module 10 is what difference does it make today? We've hinted a few things here and there, but as the structure comes together, we'll see more. Any questions about today's material? Any comments? All right. Well, that will close Module 6.